Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you happen to find yourself. My name is Carmen Mazzara. I serve as Executive Director of APSIA, the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs. We are the community for graduate schools worldwide that specialize in international affairs and policy questions, but we're also so proud to be the home of the Public and International Service Advisor Network for those of you at community colleges and undergraduate institutions across the United States. This webinar today is part of an ongoing series of ways that we hope we can support you as you build out your understanding of some of the many different possibilities and opportunities for your students in the spaces of public and international service. We are delighted to be joined by Chris Greider from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who's going to talk to us about the many possibilities at the endowment, but also perhaps give us some insights into the opportunities for your students who are interested in careers focused on research and analytics, since that's really what the endowment has done so well for so many years. So with that, I'm pleased to turn the floor over to him. I also invite you to introduce yourselves as you're comfortable in the chat. We'll also take questions in the chat as we go, and we'll pose those to Chris for his response. And if you have any technical issues, please let me know or my amazing colleague, Brittany Chor, who's really been the driving force in putting this particular session together. So thank you, Brittany, and thank you, Chris. Over to you.
Thank you. I'd like to leave most of the time for responding to direct questions, so I'll leave this pretty short. I see some familiar faces in the room, which is great, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Christopher Greider. I'm Senior Human Resources Generalist at the Carnegie Endowment. I've been fortunate enough to be working with Carnegie now for over 10 years. I started with the institution in 2012, so I think it's pretty safe to say that I know a lot about the institution, our recruitment processes. I've been working with them since I got here, and a wide level of positions ranging from even vice presidents all the way down to, not down to, but including entry-level positions. But I will focus most of my presentation on more of the entryways, but including some of the, not the baseline entry-level positions, but some of what comes after that as well. So.
Great. Could you talk to us a little, Chris, about what you see as the entryways into a place like the endowment, both in terms of full-time jobs, and then I know you all have a number of fellowship programs as well.
Right. So there are a number of different career paths. I'll talk about our junior fellows program a bit more in a moment. But we do have entry-level research support staff. So research assistants typically would come in with an undergraduate degree and probably a limited amount of experience, let's say 0 to 2 years. Now that experience could be internships, it could be working with a professor on campus, it could include their own thesis. It doesn't necessarily need to be work experience when I say 0 to 2 years. And I can tell you some of our research assistants come in, let's say, 2023 or May 23 is coming up. You could have someone who's literally about to graduate and they've still got a very impressive resume. So never ceases to amaze me. But there are other paths as well. On the administrative side, we have a number of program coordinators, as we title them. I think if you're trying to conceptualize the position, you might think of it more as a program assistant. But these are really what I would describe as the administrative hubs at the institution. They're the ones who, and the scholars freely admit this, they're the ones who keep us running, especially the research programs. They're everything from scheduling meetings, submitting financial requests, putting together events, keeping the calendar, making sure that the grant reporting is occurring as scheduled. Our research programs literally couldn't function without them. And a lot of our program coordinators have eventually gone on to a more research-focused role. Perhaps they would pursue a master's degree later on. So even though it is an entry into an administrative role, it certainly doesn't have to lead to an administrative career. But there are also other entry-level positions as well. Carnegie has a fundraising development team. That is another entry-level role. It tends to be another young professional who's interested in international affairs. Doesn't necessarily need to be interested in international relations, but as you can imagine, a lot of the people that we've had in those positions have had both interest in fundraising and also have studied international affairs. And the same with our communications team. Again, that's an area where you don't necessarily need to be have international affairs to be a great communications professional, but a lot of the people that we end up hiring and recruiting do have both. They have the communication skills. And that's where we see a lot of either dual degrees or major minor or perhaps undergraduate or like master's program where they kind of one is communications and the other is international affairs or that sort of thing. And in the entry-level communications world, it could be everything from like digital and web stuff, editorial stuff, media and outreach, and of course, events. So those are kind of the four broad pathways into the institution. I will say a little bit more about the Junior Fellows program. For those of you who don't know, the Junior Fellows program is a 10 to 12 month fellowship that we offer to just undergrads. So you have to be either freshly coming out of undergrad or you can have graduated within the past academic year. It is restricted to just undergrads. We really want to let this opportunity be for those who are coming out of undergraduate programs. It does require a nomination process. So if you're participating university, you just need to get, I see some names that are familiar, so basically go to yourself. For those of you who aren't the nominating official, feel free to reach out and I'll be happy to let you know who the person is on campus so you can coordinate your efforts. And the other great thing we do with the Junior Fellows program is we restrict it to 2 or up to 3 applications per university. So each year we have a really great different slate of schools that gets picked, or I guess really it's not the schools getting picked, it's the fellows getting picked, but the fellows come from a wide slate of universities, which is really great. So.
Thanks for that, Chris. And you talked a little bit about the impressiveness of the candidates that come forward. Can you talk about what makes them stand out to you in a positive way, particularly in terms of skills they might need or ways that they explain their work and their interests?
Sure. So I'll kind of answer this question in 2 different angles. I'll start with kind of generally with staff. I'd say generally for most staffs, I'm talking basically non-research positions. So that could be the administrative, communications, fundraising. It's kind of a marriage of the interest in the program or the research along with the skills necessary to be successful. So you're not going to necessarily take someone, not that they couldn't do the job, but you're not necessarily going to take someone with a really, really strong research background and very limited administrative experience and drop them into an administrative coordinator position. You know, the type of people that we've had who've been really successful in those positions are, and again, the experiences can surprise you. It's someone who worked in a coffee shop on weekends while they were doing their studies. It was someone who was in a sorority and planned a bunch of events. And you might think that's silly, but actually it translated really well. I guess there's something about managing sorority sisters and international affairs scholars that is quite similar. And just like, but you know, those sort we've had some who have worked kind of, like fast food, Home Depot type jobs, because it just shows that they're really well grounded. They're really good at going with the flow. Sometimes in these sorts of administrative positions, stuff gets dropped in your lap last minute and it's no one's fault, but it still has to be dealt with. So there's kind of a professional maturity that we look for. But it's also, as I said, definitely a marriage of the skill sets. We're not just going to take someone who's got all research experience and drop them into a communications position. It's going to be, we're going to select someone who has done communications, whether that's at the college level, the internship level, or some other capacity. Speaking specifically to junior fellows, as you can imagine, given the number of universities involved in the nomination process, that tends to yield a pretty elite crew of candidates who get picked. And from what I've heard, feedback from our scholars over the years largely has been, I could pick them all. Like they're all, the worst candidate I interviewed would still be a great junior fellow. That's not always true, but I'd say broadly over the many years, that probably applies to, I'd say at least 80 to 90% of the candidates we've interviewed. So what it comes down to is a few things. One, which you really can't control, is fit. And that's kind of becomes a little bit of a microcosm. So the kind of clearest, easiest example I always touch back to, and I really need to find a better example because I'm going back 9 years at this point. But it is in 2014 and now unfortunately I also have to specify which time, when the Ukraine invasion of Crimea occurred in 2014. our Russia-Eurasia program then immediately turned around and picked 2 Ukraine-focused junior fellows. And that's where I talk about fit. You could be an outstanding researcher, you could be really poised during the interview, and your area of specialty is Yemen. And for whatever reason, we just don't have any scholars who are planning to focus on Yemen for the upcoming year. And maybe, one of the other people you're competing against is focused on Egypt and the other one's focused on Beirut, and they're just better fits. So that's what I mean by fit. Sometimes it can be a topical fit. Maybe you're more interested in one particular area of kind of the overarching subject and the scholars are interested in a different area, or it could be a regional fit, like to use the Middle East and Russia-Eurasia examples. But the other aspect, which I think you can advise your students a little bit better, is about, and I'm going to turn back to the term I already used, professional maturity. To a large extent, as I already said, most of the candidates that we're interviewing, and I think this extends to research assistants as well, are highly qualified. So a lot of times the selection comes down to, and honestly, some of it also comes down to finding a candidate who's a bit humble. Sometimes when we see the candidates at the junior fellow level, there's almost a bit of arrogance that comes with it. And honestly, I don't blame the students. Some of these students that we get have been nominated for Rhodes Marshall and our fellowship, and they're truly outstanding, valedictorian of their high school and dean's list every semester. But at the end of the day, it's not, if you're going to come to a research institution like Carnegie, we're not asking you to be a scholar. We're not asking you to publish in your own name. We're asking you to be a research assistant and support. Now, we want you to be a partner. We want you to be engaged. We want you to give us your feedback. But you also have to understand who's driving the boat. And I think sometimes that actually ends up being a rather important decision, or an influencing factor is, this candidate is absolutely outstanding, but they really just want to just go get a PhD and be a scholar tomorrow. Like they're not, they don't want to be a research assistant. So when I say professional maturity, I do mean it a little different in this vein, in that we want someone who is going to say, here's the best research I can do on this topic. Here's what I think you should do. But at the end of the day, you're the scholar and I will support you in however you want to approach this paper or this book or this report or whatever it is that they're doing. And some junior fellow research assistants are able to do that and some are not. So that also ends up being an important factor.
That emotional intelligence piece comes up so often. You talked a little bit about some of the different topics that may drive demand for junior fellows in particular, noting that in the most recent invasion of Ukraine, we had a lot of heads up, but in other geopolitical events, we may not. What is the timeline for knowing what kinds of roles are going to be available and for what you're going to be hiring, and just the general timeline for applications?
Right. So I think part of the response here needs to be understanding kind of how we, how do we decide what we're hiring for, period. So the way our institution is structured is we have obviously an executive team. So we have a president and we have a vice president for studies, who's really the number 2 of the institution. He oversees all of the research program heads, and that includes, for those of you who don't know too much about Carnegie specifically, we are also fortunate, and we just launched Berlin yesterday. We have, replacing Moscow, we have a number of international centers as well. And so all of those center directors and all of our vice presidents for studies report to this SVP. So within that, the senior vice president for studies really kind of, and obviously it's a team effort, including the president, but they decide, where do we want to focus our research? The planet Earth has a lot of different geopolitical issues going on, many of which we know about, and far more that most people, and fortunately most Americans, probably can't even name the countries involved. So I'm sure your students could. They're probably the ones who go on the internet websites and can name all 192 countries, or honestly, I'm not even sure how many it is right now. But when you, sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
How you all decide what to focus on.
Right. So I think within that, the vice presidents really kind of decide, and most of our programs are generally historic, but there's wide latitude within the programs to kind of decide where they want to focus their research. The senior fellows and fellows have some latitude in deciding what they want to research. So when I'm advising junior fellow candidates in particular, but I think this also applies to research assistants, I tell them to take a look at what the program is working on, because some of the areas are quite broad. You look at, again, to use the Middle East program for an example, the Middle East is a wide region involving a huge number of countries. Our Middle East program does not produce research and writing on every single issue involved in the region. For a long time, I would have candidates who were interested particularly in Israel and Palestine issues. And I would have to tell them, you're welcome to apply to the program. But first of all, we have a high-level Arabic requirement. So, if you're kind of focusing, you may have outstanding Hebrew, but that's not going to help you with modern standard Arabic. I mean, maybe it helps you. I'm particularly bad at both languages, so I honestly couldn't tell you. But there needs to be a match, and that's where I'm coming basically around the fit again. And so when so I would say for a research assistant position, what we're looking for is kind of those tend to be a little bit more immediate. There's a specific need, someone has vacated a position, and we kind of view it as, okay, we need this to fill a particular slot. For the junior fellows program, it's a much longer term, and we do the best we can. But the reality is, and many of you have been through this process recently or may know that we just went through a selection process. This is a process that began in October of 2022. Applications were due in January of 2023, and selections were finalized about a month ago, slightly over a month ago. And the junior fellows aren't going to start until September. So while we do the best prognosticating that we can, it is to some extent guesswork. And so we kind of project, what we think will be going on in the world, what projects we kind of have and know about that are going to be happening. But to illustrate your point, I mean, there's always going to be shifts. God forbid, but if China invaded Taiwan, that would be majorly shift the focus of the Asia program for the upcoming year. And I mean, you could come up with an example for any program that we have. If there was a huge cyber attack or something involving 2 random countries, that would obviously be a huge issue for the Technology and International Affairs program. So there's definitely, to some extent, there is shifting involved. And I think that also probably plays a role in the selection process too, is feeding into what I talked about earlier, is selecting research assistants who can be flexible, because typically the junior fellows research support that we do have do not support just one scholar. They typically support at least 2. And so, again, some of the candidates that we get are truly outstanding, but in most cases, you're not going to be an absolutely perfect fit for 2 different scholars. So having a research candidate who's flexible and can provide support to multiple scholars, and possibly even shifting support, because anyone who has to deal with grant funding knows that grants don't always get renewed. So sometimes one project starts and then it ends, and all of a sudden you have to go on to a new project. So
that's great. We have advisors from many different parts of the United States, but the endowment's DC office, or the US office, is based in DC. Can you talk a little bit about how students who are outside the Beltway may particularly present themselves as competitive candidates in a way that folks who are here may be a little bit more acculturated to the way DC is?
Right. Well, we do have a presence in California now, but it's still a very small staff, 1 director and 1 program administrator. So I wouldn't start advising your students to apply to Carnegie, California just yet. Obviously, the easiest way is to do a semester in Washington. I realize it's not an option for all students for a wide variety of reasons, financial reasons, family reasons. But if you are able to do that sort of opportunity, obviously that's probably the best way to do it. But broadly speaking, I think what we're looking for as an international affairs institution really does translate pretty well across the United States. And I think what we're looking for is students and I think this actually applies to all positions, although I'm focusing on research here, but it's students who are thoughtful in their work, who really take into consideration different viewpoints, students who are really good writers, and can, it's one thing to have a great idea, but it's another thing to be able to translate that to paper. And I don't think you need to have a DC experience to be able to translate that. The one thing I will add, though, is an incredibly important part of policymaking, which influences all of us, whether we're in international affairs or not. Policymaking is everything from local roads to US policy towards superpowers. But the major part of policymaking is understanding how it works and how it's made. And so I think for your students, I would advise them to make sure that they're paying attention also to the machinations. I personally grew up in the DC area. If I turn on the local news, whether it's CBS or NBC or ABC or Fox, I'm inundated with political news. It's just part of the culture here. And I never realized how different it was until I would travel as a kid. And I'd be like, oh, they're not talking about what is happening on Capitol Hill today in Orlando, Florida, or Detroit, Michigan, because people here don't care. Unless it's a true overarching major issue. There's obviously things that I'm not saying people outside of DC don't care, but not to the same level. For us, it's daily. Like we're inundated with it. And so just making sure your students understand how is policy created, whether it's through coursework or if you're lucky enough to be in an institution with a diplomat in residence, or maybe one of their professors worked for a government institution like the State Department, and just letting them have a conversation and understand or take coursework on, how is policy actually generated? How does, when, the president of the United States, whether it's Joe Biden or Donald Trump or George W. Bush or Barack Obama, when they announce something in speech, like what happens next? Because it's one thing to understand where policy is coming from. I think most of us understand, well, policy comes from, the president and the House and the Senate or equivalent foreign bodies. But a lot of, I think, what influences our scholars' work is understanding a lot of the soft skills around that. That pronouncement or that law that's passed then requires so much more. It requires government administrators to interpret that, and it requires government lawyers to write long memos about it. It often involves court battles, especially if it's on a controversial topic. And when you're looking from an international affairs perspective, obviously you're looking at the same thing, whether it's the UN or other kind of global institutions. And so I think taking some time to understand that is probably the best way to get around the not being in the DC bubble. But again, I don't think being in the DC bubble is required to be successful in these positions. And I think a lot of that can be learned, which is one reason why our Junior Fellows program remains, minus the COVID period, of course, remains an in-person program, because I think the most valuable teachers to just come here and experience it for yourself.
That's great advice. So I have a question with two parts. You've named some more harder skills, and I don't, language skills, research, writing. What level are you looking for? Do they have to be fully fluent? Do they have to have published a lot? Do they have to have written a number of pieces or worked with a number of faculty? When you're thinking about more concrete things, how experienced do they have to be in those components? And or do you have good examples of ways students have demonstrated those things or achieved those things?
Sure, good question. Generally speaking, we try to be very honest in the level that we need for languages. So turning back to the Junior Fellows program from this past year, some of our programs have a hard fluency requirement. The Middle East program has a hard requirement for fluency in modern standard Arabic. And when I say fluency, I'm mostly referring to reading and writing. Speaking is not as important. And then other programs like the Europe program, for example, we said you can have a European language, it's great, but it's not an absolute hard requirement. So we try to be really honest, and that extends to job ads as well. We try to be very honest and straightforward in what we're looking for. I feel like I particularly am I like to make sure the job requirements truly reflect the job. If it's required, say it's required. If it's preferred, say it's preferred. If it's optional, say it's optional. So that's something I harp on. In terms of level of publishing and writing, we've had junior fellows who have come in and they have already been incredibly well published. It's kind of insane. It's like, how are you 22, 23 years old and you've already done all of this? Like, it's like I could work my whole career and not be as published as you are. By the same token, though, and don't dishearten, we have had junior fellows who have not been published at all. And the way you demonstrate that is, I think, through a well-written resume, which really outlines what you have done, major papers that you've worked on. Maybe you didn't give a byline, but you contributed to the research that one of your professors has done. Maybe you partnered with a PhD student on a project that they were working on. In terms of other ways you can demonstrate experience, it's just a matter of, I don't know, I feel like it's just, you just gotta just show what you've done. And you just gotta present on the resume. When I talk with candidates about their resumes, I feel like the biggest thing I try to convey to them is that you've got to market yourself. I think one thing that young people are always reticent to do is give themselves credit for what they've actually done. When you've worked hard on your dissertation, your thesis, and they're like, oh, well, that was just my thesis. I had to do it for class. I'm like, you still wrote an amazing 40-page paper. Give yourself some credit. Like, that's some good work you did. Yeah, maybe you haven't been published in the Wall Street Journal, but, still give yourself some credit. So I think that's my general advice to students is, don't be afraid of what you've done and what you've accomplished, and be proud of that. And I think if you're proud of that, and you really put it forward, it'll get you noticed. And the other aspect specific to the Junior Fellows Program, although I think this probably applies to others, is if you're asked for a writing sample, I would include cover letters in this as well. You got to make sure it's well written. I don't care how accomplished you are on paper. I don't care if you're that person who has been published a bunch of times. If you write a sloppy, poorly written cover letter, then what our scholars and recruiters are going to be thinking is, man, you must have gotten a lot of help. Your university's editing team must be out of this world, which is not a thing you want a hiring manager to be thinking about you. So make sure you take your time, even if you think it's not as important, to make sure that you've taken the time to put the detail into it.
I'm glad you and I agree that cover letters are not dead. That makes me happy. And thanks to everybody who's been sending me direct questions. You're also free to post them in the broader chat. The other part of my question is, you've listed some soft skills: humility, emotional intelligence, being of service. I find those things are hard for students to show and not just say, I am helpful, I am humble. Do you have advice for how students can show you and not just tell you that they possess those traits before you interview them?
Yeah, I think that's really hard on paper. I think when you're interviewing it, whether you're talking about it directly or not, I think it comes across. And I've actually had some of our scholars tell me that they actually think it's harder to pick on paper than it is to pick from the interviewed candidates. So, I mean, some of that's probably quantity too. But let's say, for example, you're considering the top 20 people who applied to a position, and you're looking at all these resumes, and they've all done some really good work. They've had good internships. Not all experiences are the same, of course, but you're comparing and contrasting, you're seeing a lot of similarities, and you're narrowing it down. And it's hard though, because you're missing that piece that you just mentioned. You don't know, is this the type of person who is going to genuinely share their thoughts on the paper, is to make it better, not in a critical sort of way. It is a critique, of course, but in a helpful critique sort of way, versus like, oh, that's a pile of garbage. Versus like, well, this is really well written, but have you considered X? And I think it's really hard to convey that in traditional job materials. And even, I think it's a little easier in the junior fellow application specifically, because your recommenders can talk about it. especially if you pick, the one thing about our junior fellows program is that we allow you to pick any recommender that you want. It doesn't have to be a professor, which gives the students a wide latitude in terms of who they can pick. I mean, it could, to use an example I brought up earlier, it could be a PhD student that you worked with and be like, look, I'm just a PhD candidate, but I've been working on this paper. This student went above and beyond, outstanding research. They really thought it through. Like, I couldn't have done this without them. And that's in some ways probably better than a super generic reference from a really big name who's like, XYZ worked for me. They did a great job. I would recommend them. Like, we've all seen those recommendations and they're completely useless. So for specific to the Junior Fellows program, there's that. In terms of what you can do, because I do like to answer questions when I can, which this one's kind of hard to answer. I would say, I think you just need to try and attack it in the cover letter if there's a cover letter there, but also in the resume. I think, you know, when you're responding, you know, everyone, I think one of my personal beliefs is I'm not a huge fan of a lot of the resume advice that's out there, partially because I think there's just too much. So everyone says something different and it becomes really redundant or really esoteric because it's not actually helpful. But one of the things that I think pretty much all people who read resumes agree on is that you should try to use action words and be descriptive in what you're doing. And so I think when you are writing your resume, you can say like, well, you know, I provided key feedback into the paper, you know, when asked for my opinion, you know, I shared my viewpoint. You know, that's not saying that my viewpoint is above and beyond the professors, but just, I think there are some kind of softer ways you can kind of incorporate some of that stuff. You know, if you're saying you did this cool research project, one of your bullet points could be like, you know, this was a new area of research for me. I had not previously been in, you know, I was not previously aware of this region, or, you know, obviously I was aware of it, but it's not something I had studied heavily. It's not something I read into. So I really took the time to do some background and try to gather so I could be more effective. So I think you've got to probably try and tell a story a little bit in the resume, in the cover letter, and that will hopefully convey that you have not just the hard skills, but also the soft skills.
That was great, very concrete advice. So thanks for, for that. One question that came forward was whether these opportunities are available to only nationals of the countries where the office is, or if they're open to international folks as well.
Yeah. So for most of our entry-level positions, the challenge is that entry-level positions generally aren't sponsorable. And while we can take students from international visas who generally have up to 1 year of work eligibility for all positions, I'd say in most cases, and I'll get to the why I said most and not all, in most cases, you know, it's not necessarily going to be the best investment to bring someone in for a year when it's probably going to take 6 months just to really get them up to speed. However, I'll end on the more positive side of that, which is our junior fellowship program fits almost perfectly into, because it is termed for 10 to 12 months. So it fits really well into the work eligibility that international students are provided. I think, as I said, I've been at Carnegie a decade now. I believe the incoming group will be, I'm not even sure, either number 11 or number 12, a group of junior fellows who I've worked with. And I believe all but one, and I believe we have 3 or 4 in the current crew and 3 or 4 incoming, have had international students as part of it. So if you do have international students who are looking for an entry-level opportunity, that's a great way to get them into the institution. I will say a brief word about sponsorship, H-1B type visas. There are some others as well, depending on the exact category. We do sponsor those for our scholar and higher level positions. It just generally requires a higher level position. And I was actually explaining this to someone the other day, that it's not just a matter of, it needs to be a marriage between the position and the candidate. So you can be a candidate who has a master's degree and you've got some really good experience behind you, which means, okay, like you are someone who could be sponsorable, but the position needs to be sponsorable as well. So if you're taking that person with a master's degree and 4 or 5 years of experience and hiring them into a position that requires a master's degree and 4 or 5 years of experience, that's probably sponsorable. But if you're hiring them to be an entry-level research assistant then they're going to say, well, the candidate, okay, like we can see it, but you don't need someone with qualifications up here to do a job that requires a bachelor's degree and 0 to 1 years of experience. So that's another important facet. So if anyone listening to this is thinking about trying to find an sponsorable position, that's definitely one important aspect to it as well. Is it's not just about your qualifications, but it's also about what the position requires.
That makes sense. We have one question asking if you could explain the difference between the Gaither Fellowship and the Scoville Fellowship. And should a student who's looking to apply for Gaither, or let's say the nuclear program, also look to something like Scoville as a second way to compete for positions at the endowment?
So the Gaither program is our fellowship. We run it for ourselves, basically. So if you get picked for the Carnegie Junior Fellowship or the James C. Gaither Junior Fellowship, you are going to work at Carnegie. The Scoville Fellowship is outstanding. We've had some great Scoville fellows over the year, but that's run by Scoville. So they would approach us and say, hey, we have this amazing fellow who's really interested in working at Carnegie. You want to host them? And then we make a determination as to whether they're a good fit, whether they're a good candidate, which, to be fair, if they've been vetted by Scoville, they almost always are. But sometimes it's just a matter of, do we actually need them? Can we offer them a valuable experience? Which in some cases has been yes, in some cases has been no. So yeah, if you have a student who wants to work, their dream is to work for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, they should definitely apply first to the James C. Gaither Junior Fellowship Program. Scoville can be a plan B, but it should not be the plan A, I think.
Of course, that makes sense. You gotta show some love to the organization itself first. And again, folks, I invite you all, if you have questions, to either send them to me directly or put them in the chat. We did have one question about the nomination process. You mentioned that there's institutions and then they select a certain number of students. How do institutions become eligible to nominate students, and how do they kind of get on your list to be able to submit possibilities?
Yeah. So in order to join, you really just need to send an email to jrfellowinfo@ceip.org. It's the same email address that we have listed on our Junior Fellows page, and one of us will reach out to you in somewhat short order. I don't always respond to that inbox as often as I should outside of nomination season, which is roughly October to March. The only real hard requirement we have in terms of joining is that it does need to be a 4-year college or university. So I know you mentioned community colleges earlier. Some of those students may ultimately choose to go to a 4-year university and then would be absolutely eligible to be nominated and apply. But just know that we wouldn't allow a 2-year college or university to join directly. But if you're a 4-year college or university, you're more than welcome to join. You might even be in a situation where your primary university is a member. So I'm from Maryland, so it's an easy example for me. So the primary campus in the University of Maryland's case would be the University of Maryland in College Park, but the University of Maryland in Baltimore County can nominate separately. And in most cases, if it's truly, so I'll use Penn State as an example because my brother went to Penn State. So, Penn State has campuses all over the state of Pennsylvania, but broadly speaking, they're really just affiliated campuses with the main university. Whereas University of Maryland, Baltimore County really do operate as separate institutions. So that's kind of where we draw the distinction in terms of would you be nominating? And to be fair, in both of those situations, so if you're attending a satellite of Pennsylvania State University, you could still apply through Pennsylvania State University. We just wouldn't allow that campus to be its own nominating institution. Whereas if it's the situation where I mentioned with like University of Maryland, College Park versus Baltimore County, we do allow them to operate separately. But if you're not sure, let us know and we'll kind of make a determination as to what makes the most sense. We generally do try to be pretty inclusive in terms of who we allow to join. We're not interested in being elitist or anything like that. We want as many universities, we want as many students to have the opportunity to apply as possible. I always root for the highest amount of applicants we can possibly get, even though it creates more work for me and my team. Not that I really have a team, Angela, who supports me. But you know, I want as many students to have the opportunity as possible, and I want our scholars to have a great slate of students to pick from. And almost every year since I've been at Carnegie, and that includes the incoming group, if you go to the link that Carmen shared, you'll see that you know, our current incoming junior fellows group, you know, I mean, there are always going to be certain universities that may or may not be Ivy League who get picked almost every year. But there are almost always names that you wouldn't necessarily expect or being selected for the first time. And I think the current group is also representative of that. It also includes state universities, includes large universities, small universities, some from the Midwest, some from the Northeast, some from the South, some from the West Coast. So yeah, we encourage everyone, well, if you're a four-year college or university, to join. So please just reach out and we'll get something together.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned that the application process is a cover letter, a resume, and letters of recommendation. Are there other pieces for the fellowship that are expected? And for a more traditional job, is it typically just the cover letter and the resume, or are there other pieces as well?
Yeah, typically for a normal job, it would be just a resume and a cover letter. For the fellowship, there's actually 5 required documents in addition to answering a series of questions, mostly just, you know, who are you and demographic information, that sort of thing. The 5 documents are a resume, a 1-page personal statement, similar to a cover letter, but a little different. A 3-page substantive essay, which effectively serves as a writing sample, 2 letters of recommendation, and then we do require students, or I guess advisors on behalf of their students, to present their undergraduate transcript so our scholars can see what coursework that they've taken. But for the other entry-level positions I've talked about, it is just the traditional resume, cover letter. Now, sometimes students will provide a writing sample, sometimes we may request one, but it's usually not required at application unless specified otherwise.
Thank you. Any other questions, folks? Things that are burning, things that you know students are going to ask you the minute you tell them you came to a session like this? Chris, I think one of my last questions, in your role from HR, how much evaluation does HR do? How much evaluation do the scholars do? Who are the decision makers in the process?
Sure, that's a good question. And before I forget, I do want to talk a little bit about where some of these entry level positions lead, so we can talk about that after I respond to your direct question. My philosophy, and I think this is my personal philosophy as an HR person, is I think that there are certain things that I can and cannot evaluate, and I accept that. And I'll use IT as a very specific example. You know, and evaluate if someone can write and communicate effectively. I can evaluate if someone seems like they'd be a good colleague. I can evaluate if someone has certain college or experience requirements. I can pull that off their resume. But, you know, if you want to tell me that they can, you know, do something with Meraki Cisco switches and that they know how that interacts with the server, and then they can then troubleshoot that and follow up with Microsoft, and they know how Active Directory and Duo and all these other things influence. I mean, I've already confused myself and I'm making it up as I go along. So, so my general philosophy is that I try to screen as much as I can because I do want to make things easier for the hiring manager. You know, when this doesn't really apply to the junior fellows program, I'm talking more about other positions. I feel like the junior fellows program, to be quite honest, the people on the screen and your colleagues do most of that work for us. We get very few applications that I would say are not at least good. They're almost all B pluses or above. I'm talking about just general, we just do a blast. So, you know, I'm pulling out the people who apply to an entry level job and say that they want, you know, 200,000 a year. I'm pulling out the people who apply to an finance and accounting job and have never worked in finance or accounting in their entire life and don't even have a related degree, if they have a degree at all. But, you know, I mean, obviously screen more than that as well. but I think it's a balancing act. It's trying to balance what I feel comfortable screening out with what I don't feel comfortable screening out. So for some positions, like a program assistant, for example, like they'll do some pretty hefty screening. I feel like at that point, I have a pretty good sense of what the position does. I'm like, oh, this person has great administrative experience and they have events experience. And you can see I'm literally checking boxes mentally, of course. I'm not physically checking boxes. But as I'm reading through the materials, I'm like, okay, like this person seems like they're a great fit. This absolutely needs to go to the hiring manager. And for other positions, I'll be like, this seems generally like a good finance and accounting person. I think someone who actually understands finance and accounting needs to look at this more closely. So it's definitely a bit of a balancing act. And then some of it's also a little dependent on who I'm working with. Some hiring managers will want to see top 10, top 20. So they're really asking me to judge, and others are more than happy. I mean, I had one vice president for communications who's no longer at Carnegie, who I think would have been perfectly happy if I just sent him all 500 applications that came in. He wanted to see it all. He didn't care. Not that he didn't trust me. He did, but just like he was happy to see as many as I was willing to send him. So if I sent him 150, he was happy about that. Other hiring managers I've worked with would have emailed me and been like, what is wrong with you? Like, why did you send me 150 applications? So that plays a role too. But yeah, I think it's understanding what you can and cannot evaluate. And we don't use any sort of electronic screening. I'm not a big believer in them for a number of reasons. One of many is that they often tend to be just not all that accurate. And they tend to inherit the biases of the people who program them. And so, all of our applications, even for those jobs that we do, and 500 is not a fake number. We have literally had jobs at Carnegie where we've gotten 500 or more applications. All 500 of those applications, a human's eyes have looked at them and made a determination on whether they should advance or not. So
that was going to be my next follow-up question, was about numbers. Both numbers of applications for the different roles, and then I'm disappointed that Carnegie does not pay $200,000 for an entry-level role. But would you give us some broad sense of what the salary expectations are at that most entry level?
Yeah, I mean, things have definitely come up a little bit over the years. I think the junior fellow salary, as posted publicly, is 45. And I would say broadly for most entry-level positions, you should be expecting something in the 45 to 50 range. And I should be clear, I mean, I'm talking 0 years of experience, you just graduated. If you're a little bit above that, 50 to 55 is certainly not out of reach. But I would say super broadly, and that's not just Carnegie specific, that's based on, I'm obviously familiar with other think tanks and what they pay for similar roles. And if there are any students who end up watching this presentation, one challenge that you get out there is that titles are kind of murky. So you'll see a research assistant at one institution that's like ours, that's really undergraduate degree, 0 to 1 years of experience. At another institution, that same research assistant might have a master's degree and 2 years of experience. And that's just what they recruit as research assistants. And of course, hopefully, if you're going to require a master's degree and 2 years of experience, you're paying a lot more than what we're paying for a bachelor's degree in 0 to 1 year. So that does make things a little murky. So when you see those recommended pay ranges from PayScale or salary.com or Glassdoor or whatever, you do need to take those with a grain of salt, that they're aggregating across a very wide swath of information, and that they may not necessarily be drilling down to the exact position that you're applying to. So
the other grain of salt to take is the size of the institution. So even among the think tank families, there are organizations with lots of endowments, very small endowments, ones who have to raise every nickel they give away. So that's another lens for students to put on, particularly the salary piece as well. Couple other questions. If students want to know who they should reach out to about the application process, are the contacts listed on your website, or is it just reaching out to you to find out who the point of contact at a particular institution is?
I think we would probably discourage students to reach out just from an application. If we want to contact the student, we will reach out to them, and then they'll know exactly who to reach out to. I would love to reach out to every student across the country interested in Carnegie, but that would become my full-time job, would be just doing outreach. So, you know, it's yeah, it's a balancing
Yeah.
act.
Sorry, to
But yeah, if
clarify,
you were,
if someone's a
okay.
student at Tufts,
Mhm.
how would they find out who the nominator is
Oh,
from
in that
Tufts?
case, yes, they should absolutely reach out to us. I think in most cases, it should be very clear, but if for some reason it's not, they can reach out to us and we'll put them in touch. Because we do kind of list titles in an attempt to not have to update the page quite as often. I don't know how much it actually works. But yeah, if a student's having trouble, and we had a situation last year with the university, I'm not sure if they're represented or not on this call, where they kind of had some administrative changes. There have been some budget cuts. The office that had done it for a long time was no longer going to be doing it. And so I had several students reach out to me directly, and I was working with the students, and I was working with a couple campus officials, and it was kind of a process, but it worked out. A couple of the students were able to be nominated. We're kind of limited because we really, we're not trying to influence university policy. Obviously, we're an outside institution. We're just kind of like, tell us who the nominating official is, and we'll go from there. But
Makes sense. One of our colleagues has had some students who've had some luck in the process, either being a finalist, but not selected for hire or getting close. Do you all provide feedback to the applicant and to the advisors so that they can improve their chances or make sure they send you even better qualified candidates?
yeah, so our policy has been not to send feedback to students. However, we will provide feedback to universities. So if you have a student who you thought was particularly strong but didn't make the interview cut, or if you, as described, had a student who was interviewed but not ultimately selected, feel free to reach out, and I'll reach out to the program, and I'll let you know, like, was there a specific weakness that held the student back? Were they super strong and basically like you did everything right, you just ran into someone who was also really good. So like we're definitely open to providing feedback to universities. We just don't provide it specifically to students. So
Makes sense. And you've talked a little bit as we've revisited about hard skills and soft skills and experiences that's been specific to Carnegie, but do you think these trends are broader for think tanks across the policy and international affairs space? Are there things that you think are distinct to you all that students who wanted to compete for other similar roles may not be as involved, need to be as involved in?
that's a good question. I definitely think there are some trends across all think tanks. I still think there's a lot of value in what's traditionally been called the kind of soft skills, the qualitative research. But I do think there's been a broader trend towards quantitative skills. I've seen that internally within Carnegie. Even programs that traditionally haven't valued those quantitative skills seem to be, I wouldn't necessarily say placing an emphasis on it, but I think it's become more valuable than it had been previously. And that seems to be the way the trend's going. And I think part of that is just when we look kind of across society, like what international affairs issues are top of mind right now. It's things like climate change. It's things like technology and international affairs, which for us would include cyber warfare, artificial intelligence. I mean, I'm sure everyone on this call has heard Chat GPT in the last week, if not the last 24 hours. And so these things are top of mind, and these are things that are type of areas that do require a little bit more skills. But I think that's just a trend. I mean, I don't think the qualitative analysis need is dying at Carnegie anytime soon. We certainly have a lot of programs that do qualitative analysis. And when you look at the field of international affairs, going back to what I said earlier, so much of it is truly just policy. So yeah, there's a lot that you can do with some of these tools, whether it's R, Stata, or ArcGIS. There's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with those programs. Some of these fellows and research assistants can go so many miles over my head with their abilities in these programs. But I think there's still just a ton of value in just understanding how policy is made and the qualitative stuff that goes into it, and just relationships between countries and individuals and how that plays a role in policy making. So anyway.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I think you're right. That's the piece that's not as in the news, not as sexy, doesn't get as much love and emphasis these days, but underpins so much of what's going on. The last question that I have, and I'm going to thank everybody for being part of this conversation, and thank you, Chris, of course, for all of the great insights you've shared. You've mentioned several times that folks can reach out to you, either to find out who their colleague on campus is, or just for more information. Would you mind sharing your contact information, or letting us know which address we should point folks towards?
Sure. I'll share both of these in the chat. If you're trying to reach me for a junior fellow specific reason, maybe you're joining, maybe you have a junior fellow question, I would ask that you do email me at the jrfellow@ceip.org address. If you're trying to reach me directly in a non-junior fellow capacity, maybe you have a question about Carnegie, maybe you have a question, or one of your students has a question about a position at Carnegie, then you can reach out to me at my personal email, which is first initial C, last name Grider. So cgrider@ceip.org. And I'll go ahead and share both of those in the chat for everyone.
And while you do that, I will again say thank you so much for all of this great insight. We know how many students are wanting to begin their careers in research, in analysis, unpacking some of these major geopolitical issues that you all tackle every day. So we're really grateful that you provide such a wonderful way in for students at the beginning of their journey. Thank you to all of our advisors as well. We look forward to seeing you next month and every month for your PISA Advisor Workshop. And we try to include as many different opportunities for your students to publish, to get that experience, to get that exposure in my every Friday emails. So we hope yours will be fantastic candidates when they cross Chris's desk and he'll say, oh, wow, my job just got so much harder. So thanks to all of you for being here. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you at the next PISA webinar. We can end the recording. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.